Good evening, everyone. I thought I would do something a little bit different today. A bit more laid back, chill, less scripted, less overexcited G4 host shouting at you, because the III initiative just wrapped up as I'm recording this. It is an indie event that brings together a bunch of developers from across the world, presented in this sort of E3-esque bombastic flair, which is actually an issue I kind of have with it, but I'll get into that in a second. Now, I'm not going to talk about every game that they showed, just because there are some genres I don't personally care for. You know, I liked Satisfactory, but that doesn't mean that I'm going to like every single automation game. And I've said it before, but I'm pretty biased against roguelikes. But there were still some pretty cool games that I think would be interesting to talk about. First up, we have Neverway, which is by ex-Celeste developers. If you weren't following, the whole saga after Celeste was the team was working on a new game called Earthblade, but creative differences caused the team to sort of fracture apart, and the game got cancelled. A couple of people in that team were working on their own game, and that's what Neverway is. It's a mix of life sim and horror RPG. And I think that that's kind of an interesting mix, because usually with farming games or life sim games, you expect this huge community aspect. But in the trailer, it looks like you're kind of on your own in this desolate world. So I'm curious to see how that impacts the usual gameplay loop. Now, starting with Neverway is a little odd for me, because how do you define III? I feel like the general idea behind the III initiative was to sort of be like the AAA of indie games. And I guess if Celeste is considered a AAA game because it's so popular, then a game by some developers of Celeste makes some sense to lead off the show. But for me personally, I kind of think of III as like what single or AA used to mean in the industry, you know, not just people in their bedroom making a game, but small studios, just without Capcom or Square Enix publishing. And there were definitely games like that in this showcase, like Endless Legend 2, a spin-off of Deep Rock Galactic, and The Altars, but there were definitely a few games that looked like they were by pretty small teams. And I'm not knocking them. I mean, I love indie games, and I love the nichest indie games. But I guess I'm not exactly sure what definition the III initiative is trying to push here. I also think that that bombastic E3 style approach doesn't really work for me personally. That kind of energy is why I don't really like E3 shows. And so I'm not sure if they're doing that because they're aiming this at AAA gamers or, you know, indie gamers, the people who actually buy indie games. I guess I'm saying I would prefer a slightly less in-your-face soundscape. But okay, let's talk about the games. So Tears of Metal is a roguelike, and again, I'm not a huge fan of them, and I also think that games tend to use roguelike and roguelite interchangeably, and that must be really annoying to actual fans of rogue games. But what I will say is this Dynasty Warriors style action gameplay is something we really haven't seen in the indie space, and I think it's interesting that even in 2025, there are still tributes and homages that we're only now seeing for the first time from indie developers. But, you know, I guess the question I always have for these roguelike games is, you know, what's the progression going to be like? What's the handcrafted content going to look like? And I'm never really going to get that from a trailer, which is why it's hard for me to get super invested in games like this. SacriFire is one that I have played. It was in a Next Fest, I think, a year ago. And as you can see, it's got that HD 2D look to it. And I think that that's pulled off pretty well in the game, though I'm not 100% sold on the story yet. But the combat's kind of neat. It's this mix of action gameplay with a little bit of menuing. I'm always a big fan when a RPG developer tries something new or different with their battle system. Hopefully it's a battle system that has greater depths to explore as the game goes on, and that it doesn't get super repetitive, which was an issue that I had with Oddventure, a game I'll be talking about in a YouTube short next week. Frostrail is, I think, now the second game that I've seen in the train survival subgenre. I know that there's Void Train. I actually downloaded a demo of Void Train like years ago, and it just sits there on my laptop unplayed. I think it's neat that you have a base that is mobile and you essentially are bolstering it by going out and finding resources to bring back. You could also see Forever Skies as another game in this genre, or maybe even Raft. And that also extends to the game Outbound. Here you've got a camper van that you're upgrading and putting stuff in and getting tools, and there's craft trees and all that. But I also like that it looks like you're sprucing up like a national park. There was this indie game a while back called Haven Park, which had you doing the same thing, but it was on a much smaller scale. It was kind of more like a short hike. And it wasn't a perfect game, but I really liked the gameplay loop in it. And so if that's what Outbound is, sort of like a bigger scale take on this, then I'm absolutely interested in trying that game and seeing what it has to offer. The game that maybe excites me the most is weirdly Escape Simulator 2. I've talked about before in past videos and social media discussions about how I think that sequels need to justify their existence. And just by sheer virtue of the glow up alone, I think that this does justify itself because it's got a lot more tech under the hood, and that probably will mean more features and gimmicks that the community can use. If you're unfamiliar, the first Escape Simulator was, it's an escape room game, but it had this huge community support. They basically gave like all of the tools to the community, and they've made like their own full campaigns and super devious puzzle rooms on their own. It's like the reason you get Escape Simulator is not just to play the campaign, but to play everything that the community has made. Hopefully, Escape Simulator 2 will support those Escape Simulator 1 rooms. I mean, it might not be compatible, but if it is compatible, that would be great. The one sort of anime game in the initiative was Opus Prism Peak, and Opus is a series that has had an interesting growth arc to it. It started off as this more like Flash-like 2D series, and to just see its budget grow and grow and their storytelling get more and more ambitious has really been a sight to see. I'm someone who's like really far behind on this series. I need to go through and play a lot of them. But I know that this one's going to really stir up the waterworks. It's got a girl that's disabled and might have a terminal illness, and you're taking her to this mountaintop, and you can just tell that there's going to be a lot of emotions and heartwarming moments as well as heart-wrenching moments. Anyone that's followed the channel at this point knows that I love 3D platformers, and so obviously I gravitated to Dusk Fade immediately, but Dusk Fade? We're going with Dusk Fade? I really can't stand portmanteau names in gaming. It almost feels like Mad Libs. Like, surely there's something better that you can draw out of the characters and world that you have. But, it looks okay. It's kind of like a mix of action RPG and 3D platformer. It's got the rail grinding that every 3D platformer's gotta have. Now, this is gonna sound super nitpicky, but it's really gonna come down to how the jump feels, because there's a lot of indie 3D platformers that don't have a good feeling jump. And I know that sounds stupid, but it's 50% of what you do in a 3D platformer, so it needs to feel good, in my opinion. And looking at the footage, I'm not sure if it's going to have a good jump in it, but it's also not coming out until 2026, so it's got some time to kind of suss that out. When the trailer for Into the Fire started, I wasn't 100% sold on it initially until I saw the tinfoil covered sort of hazmat suity guy blasting away at like seemingly supernatural fire. I do think that firefighter games are pretty neat, but this one seems to be using it as more of like a hopeless backdrop where you have absolutely no way of containing this entire fire because it's such a supernatural event, but you can at least tamp it down in certain areas long enough to get in there and rescue people. So that seems pretty cool. I'll look forward to seeing what they unveil about the game in the next few months. There's Rematch, which is this sort of NFL Blitz take on soccer. I know a lot of people are going to say Rocket League because it's got that kind of aesthetic, but I mean, come on, Rocket League is soccer. What are we doing, folks? I just never know with multiplayer games, and for this to be the next game from the Seafood developers is a little bit of a letdown for me. All I can say is that I hope that they find a willing community to keep its support going beyond the first couple of months. Now, aside from Endless Legend 2, I think The Altars is probably the biggest game in this showcase. And I've played the demo. It's got a lot of things going on, from base building to citizen management to exploration and survival and crafting. It's by the Frostpunk developers, so it's definitely going to be brutal. And the wheelbase is cool. It's yet another traversal base. But it is pinning a lot of hopes on its narrative, and so I hope that that narrative has a satisfying arc and pacing to it. You know, video game stories are really hard to thread the needle and impress me. Now, I mentioned my roguelite hate, and it's mostly just that I prefer handcrafted levels, you know, a natural beginning, middle, and ending to a campaign, but there sure were a lot of them in this showcase, huh? I already mentioned a couple, and then there's Moonlighter 2, Entropy Effect, Galactic Survivor, Super Fantasy Kingdom, Voidbreaker. You know, everyone talks about how Metroidvanias are oversaturated, and I didn't see a single one in this showcase. Now, I don't actually begrudge people who are into roguelites. I just wish the coverage in these events was a little more evenly spread. I actually think it's cool that Saga Emerald Beyond is doing a crossover with Vampire Survivors, even though I personally don't really like that game. I know, knives pointed at Flynn Rider, it's a hot take, but I just don't care for it. But the developers' continued support of the game post-launch is just wild for how cheap it is. At this point, I think we're coming on like 3 years since launch, and they're still putting out free updates for it. It's ridiculous. Aside from No Man's Sky, I don't think you can make a stronger case for a labor of love than Vampire Survivors. And then Voidbreaker, you know, sometimes I do look into the first-person shooter roguelites, although most of them still tend to disappoint me. But the interesting thing about Voidbreaker is this experimental weapon system where you can mix and match different elements, 3 all at once. And that kind of reminds me, this is so stupid, it kind of reminds me of Copy Kitty. I don't know if anybody else played that game, but Copy Kitty was this really fun, really awesome indie game that kind of reminded me of a mix of Kirby and Mega Man, and they had all these different weapons in the game, and you could mix and match up to 3 of them to create new weapons, and just the creativity and the interactivity was so off the charts in that game. So the idea of having that in a first-person shooter is actually kind of exciting. Although the execution of it was a little hard to read in the trailer, I'm not sure if I could tell a huge difference between some of the effects. We're definitely on a path, though, to eventually have a first-person Nuita, and that's going to be amazing. And then to go over some of the other games, Over the Hill kind of looked like a Death Stranding for cars. Enshrouded just keeps moving along with content updates. I have not gone back to it since my initial video, but I'm gonna wait until the 1.0 release comes out. V Rising is another game that just keeps on getting post-launch support. Maybe I'll look into this game. We saw The Eternal Life of Goldman again, and they had a lot of composers talk about their approach to the game. And it's just nice to see another game going for classical animation without it being a Cuphead knockoff, and that they actually have the chops to do it. Clover Pit seems like it's going for somewhere in between Buckshot Roulette and Balatro. Personally, for me, I prefer stuff like Inscription, where there's more of a story and exploration to it. No, I'm Not Human's The Thing style of gameplay is interesting, but I'm not sure exactly what the general loop is going to be. Like, do I have the option to just not let anybody in? Can I just be a hermit like I am in real life? And then finally, Katana Zero had a DLC trailer, which is something that's been in the works for a very long time, but they showed off more of it, and there's just some really gorgeous artwork being shown in the cutscenes. I mean, the gameplay itself seems about the same, just new areas. So, on the whole, I kind of have mixed feelings about this III initiative. I think that if the goal was to show the very best of the best indie games, I'm not necessarily sure if they pulled that off. There are a fair number of games that I would put above these in my wish list, particularly some of the games that I played in the most recent Next Fest, as well as games like Radio the Universe, Luna Abyss, My Familiar, Strange Antiquities, Perfect Tides Station to Station, Dim Haven Enigmas, Hail to the Rainbow, and Waltz and Jam. And I think that you're seeing with some games like Blueprints that sometimes an indie phenomenon just kind of happens, and it's not something you can really predict. I still appreciate that events like this exist, especially III, The Mix, Future Game Show, the PC Gaming Show. But when there are so many indie games out there, and you're promising that you're curating essentially the very best games, I want to be able to come away from an event thinking, oh man, I want to wishlist almost everything from that. And I feel like, at least for this show, there are only a few that I want to wishlist, namely Escape Simulator 2 and Into the Fire. But, you know, my opinion's just my own. And the great thing about indie games is that everybody coming into it has completely different tastes. And so what might be a lackluster show for me could be a fantastic show for someone else. So if you like the III initiative, go ahead and leave a comment. And let me know what your favorite game was. And also let me know if you kind of prefer this more laid-back approach to game coverage. Now, I'm still doing a highfalutin, super effort review video on Tuesday for the animated film Sirocco and the Kingdom of Winds. So definitely be on the lookout for that. And as always, if you like what I'm doing, you can subscribe, you can hit the like button because that works with the algorithm engagement or whatever. And of course, I've got a Patreon where you can support me and get early access to videos as well as a few bonus videos. I don't have a fancy credit sequence for this one because it's kind of off the cuff, but I will for Tuesday. And yeah, that's it. So until next time, you'll find me in another castle.